just heard is probably a little familiar to you, I hope. This is Beethoven, and that specifically was his Ninth Symphony, Opus 125, sometimes known as just choral or finale in D minor. It's extremely emotionally powerful. The entire pieces, of course, and even just those specific chords, that rhythm, there is a really you can listen to this and get a little bit of a deeper grasp in a way than me just explaining through words what is happening during this period of Romanticism. Beethoven is coming, he's right on the cusp there as we're moving from the Baroque and what we often just call classical or Baroque music, those like Bach, Handel, and others. And now we're at the cusp here of this Romanticism. Let's talk about Romanticism. What do I mean by Romanticism? Here, of course, is Beethoven. Gifted individual. Possibly my favorite composer. I don't know. I go back and forth between him and Bach all the time for very different reasons. One of the things about Beethoven that's so inspiring to me is that he, as you may know, lost his hearing at some point in his life, and he only started to work out music by sawing the legs off of his piano, they say, putting it on the floor, and pressing his head down on the ground so that he could hear the vibrations through the keys. There is something about, unlike Mozart, who would write and it would just flow out of him, Beethoven seemed to partake in this struggle of composing his music. And I think, again, there's something about this. There's something about how the emotion that went into the very overcoming of his own natural disability and conditions was part of what made his music so memorable. And it's still reminiscent of the time in which we're moving into as well, in the same way. The emotions that come up for us, the sentiment as we are attempting to overcome the darkest, deepest, largest monoliths of nature. So if you've never yet really gone out and simply looked up at the sky, it's hard to get away from all the city lights these days. It's gotten worse and worse over even the years I've been alive. But if you can get far enough away from the city and you've ever really looked up at the sky and just watched for a while and thought about how vast what we call nature is, then you are at least at the threshold of what the Romantics were contending with in their revelation, in their adoration even of something greater and more horrific, but also more beautiful than humanity itself in a way. Although humanity, you'll see, is going to ultimately be part of the way in which nature expresses itself. So, again, we ask, what is Romanticism? It's not this. What is this? The term romantic has come to mean, of course, nowadays, romance in general coming to mean this love affair between people. It's so much more complicated than this, but like so many concepts that we've had to let go of with their modern usages, being a romantic did not necessarily have anything to do with what we call romance today. That is, being in love and falling in love and everything. Romeo and Juliet, Shakespearean type stuff. There's nothing wrong with that stuff, naturally, but it's really not about that. What it does have a lot to do about are certain themes and devices that are used throughout the period. One that Gaarder uses himself very consistently and thoroughly starting from this point on in the book, if you haven't noticed already, is romantic irony. we can see that this speaks specifically to a literary device where an author breaks with the illusion of a work and exposes it for the composed fiction that it is. If you've watched enough films and movies, you've probably seen it happen regularly enough. It happens in theater. It started in theater, really, which is where it gets its name. Breaking the fourth wall. So when you break the fourth wall, what that means is that you, in a film, often look directly at the camera and speak to it as if the camera itself is a character, as if you, the audience, are being recognized as being viewers of a work of fiction. Obviously, in theater, when you are watching people perform on a stage, there are the three walls, and then you're supposedly seeing through the fourth wall. So when someone would do this in theater, speak directly to the audience, it would be called breaking the fourth wall. Now, this in itself doesn't necessarily comprise a type of romantic irony. However, a reference in breaking the fourth wall to the work certainly does, and we can say at this point that in film and such, once the fourth wall is broken, we've essentially done that. We've referred to how the context for the fiction itself is the context that you're in, not simply the context of the story, the setting, and so forth that we're in, we who are in this fiction, characters in this fiction. Now, I wanted to play specifically on music for a moment because music has so many times in history, and even today in many cases, is described as possibly the most perfect art form. And there's a reason why we're going to spend a lot of time talking today about art as we move into talking about Hegel and a couple of his predecessors. In other words, what we're really going to be talking about today is the concept, or really branch in philosophy, of aesthetics. So it's not just about art per se, and yet obviously art is one way that this culminates for the human being. But we have up to this point never really exemplified what aesthetics is. We've never really discussed some sort of definition of it. We know it has something to do with art. And for this reason, I think it turns to remain off many philosophers' lists of the branches of philosophy, if only because it's sometimes an unwieldy concept for many people. But I think it's far simpler than we give it credit for. So think for a second about the branches we've explored very thoroughly. For instance, epistemology. What is epistemology? Is it knowledge itself? Well, no. It's our attempt to reconcile the preconditions by which knowledge is possible. So the preconditions for knowledge are described, and there are many different descriptions, of course, depending on the philosopher, but it's described by epistemology. What about metaphysics? Ontology. Well, metaphysics is precisely our discussion of the preconditions for the physics that are exhibited in the world. So each of these philosophical branches seem to have something to do with preconditions. What is logic? The preconditions for reason. How is it by which we can go about reasoning things in a way that is functional and makes sense? What are ethics? Ethics are the preconditions for morality, you could say. So we can find philosophy to be, in a way, by way of these branches, this very elaborate study, often recognizing the connections between different disciplines and even within the branches themselves, of the preconditions for all these important things to us as human beings. That's pretty fascinating. So aesthetics? Well, it's not art. One way we could describe aesthetics is as the preconditions for art. Naturally, though, I always want to take this another step. If art is what human beings do, is there a way we can generalize even further to things outside of human beings? And I think we can. I think that if you go down this path with me for a moment, I think this gets a little bit closer to what would be a more viable definition for experience itself. You see, I don't mean experience in the way that empiricists do, by way of simply what is available to the senses and pure sense data. I, as many do, mean experience to be all sorts of different things. The way that I experience a painting is not based alone on some version of sense data. If you've ever been in a museum and seen a famous painting and gone up to it just close enough that you can almost smell the oils of the paint, the senses are definitely a part of that experience. But then it's the experience itself that matters. And that experience may include all sorts of things that my senses alone don't partake in. For instance, this overwhelming curiosity about what I'm seeing, or perhaps even like a welling up of certain other emotions that I wasn't anticipating when I was first told about this painting or heard it described. And this is an important part of aesthetics that we will see helps us get a little bit closer to what it means to be a romantic in the philosophical sense or in the historical sense. Romanticism saw this aesthetic experience as being a primal one and an important one. For a deeper sense of what's happening during Romanticism, let's take a look at a couple of other works. Here's one of my absolute favorites. It haunts me to this day, actually. The Nightmare. So what Henry Fuseli has painted here is very stimulating, needless to say, and hopefully you can tell. It's very dark, and it has some essence of fairy tale in it. Now, Gaarder describes the fairy tale as the sort of absolute ideal of romantic work. And whether we want to take that to the bank or not, we can definitely see time and again the sort of horror as well as the beauty of the fairy tale being exhibited in so many of these works. If you're not already familiar with the Brothers Grimm, go take a look at them. Not the Hollywood version of them, of course, but the classic version of them, the version that people first came to know. Many of those stories that inspired the first Disney films. We just recently watched Sleeping Beauty, which has got to be perhaps my all-time favorite Disney film, and I haven't watched very many since. Masterpieces of simplicity in the storyline, and yet darkness in theme, as well as the overcoming of that darkness toward a light where possible. But come back to this painting for a second. What's happening here? So what we see here is a woman lying on the bed, and she's clearly not just sleeping. She seems to be tussling about, wrestling with something in her own mind, of course. So it's sleep, but it's not some peaceful, restful sleep. It's some struggle that she seems to be going through. And if you look closely, her eyes, almost even though they're closed, we can almost see them as being rolled back in her head, as if she's really more than anything being possessed. And possessed by what? Perhaps possessed by this creature sitting on top of her. That creature, by the way, it's my understanding is that it's supposed to represent incubus. Now, incubus comes from actual folklore back in the day where people would experience something called sleep paralysis. It's something I've experienced more often than I'd like to admit, fortunately when I was younger, not recently. This head, this horse's head that you see on the left-hand side, eyes completely glazed over, it's frightening to me, and it's the sort of thing that I've seen more than once, come out from behind the curtains of the room I'm in, perhaps, as I'm in the sleep state. So I had no idea, actually, what this was for the longest time, and then I saw this painting and immediately identified for myself what this experience was, perhaps, that the woman is having. And then, of course, that sadly gave me the idea of the horse's head to then, the next time I was in sleep paralysis, start to see that guy again. That's frightening. So, what is being portrayed here is not simply, though, sleep paralysis itself. There was already probably a good number of people who were attempting to scientifically explain what was going on that caused this phenomena of people opening their eyes, and maybe even trying to look about them, even try and move parts of their body, but really you couldn't. We could come up with scientific explanations, but that wasn't what the romanticists in art and in poetry necessarily needed as a way of representing what this experience was like. See, part of the whole point of science is to try and explain the things that are unexplained. And you will be on the right track in any scientific endeavor if you try to literally describe in some way all aspects of a phenomenon. That is, if there is something that happens and I'm able to give you a literal description of what happened or what is behind what is going on, I'm doing some form of science. This is really different from art or the aesthetic experience, and part of what the romanticists really started to delve into here was the fact that some things are in a way inexhaustible or impossible to literally translate. I like to give the example all the time. If I am viewing a Picasso painting that you have never seen before, and I simply describe it to you, there is no way you're going to have the sort of aesthetic experience necessary to really appreciate the painting or really understand perhaps even what it's about, whatever that means, at all. You would actually have to be in front of the painting and viewing the painting, preferably in all its glory and detail in person. You can, of course, just look at images like this on the web and get a glimpse of what it would be about. But that, too, is, in a way, almost like a truncated version of the experience of really being there and seeing the painting in person. You cannot scientifically explain away certain phenomena then and hope that you've captured all that the human being is capable of experiencing. And again, we will not limit this only to human beings, but for now, that's what the Romanticists were interested in. What Isaiah Berlin has called, back in the 1960s, has called before the possibility of being beautiful but not profound, is where we can maybe find something beautiful, but something that cannot, something that is beautiful and could be basically explained. Oh, I saw a beautiful flower today. Maybe that's not enough. I actually think that being in person and experiencing the flower firsthand is the only way you can really understand that beauty. But maybe you've seen enough magnolias in your life that if I said, oh, there was this magnolia, the leaves were just in perfect order, it was in full bloom, you could probably have enough of an idea of what that's like to capture the beauty of the idea, or perhaps even see another magnolia somewhere near you and have a similar enough experience that you understand the beautiful. But that's not the same as the profound. For the Romanticists, the profound is recognizing the impossibility of capturing certain elements of our world, certain phenomena that are, in a sense, too infinite in their possible meaning to be captured at all. And this, again, makes us wonder, it prompts us to think of how aesthetics is very different from maybe epistemology in the scientific endeavor. We can say in epistemology that it's impossible to know everything. However, that doesn't limit us from attempting to know. Aesthetics, if we come from this perspective then, that by default, not only is it impossible to capture a full aesthetic experience or an experience of something at all, but in fact, part of what makes it an aesthetic experience, part of what makes it what it is in its profundity and its depth, is that impossibility. So while we may be trying to overcome that impossibility, as it were, through epistemological means and descriptions and theories of knowledge and so forth, in aesthetics, we are having to simply embrace the very fact of that impossibility in the first place. Now, the description I'm giving still has a bit of that romanticist bent, and we need to figure out how we get to that. We also need to spend some time on Hegel today. Now, the description I'm giving still has a bit of that romanticist bent, and we need to figure out how we get to that. We also need to spend some time on Hegel today. So let's take a look at, again, some more work here and see if we can make our way through it. Here is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This is the front cover of the book as it appeared in 1831. And if you haven't yet, check out Frankenstein, which is obviously the story of the scientist, not the monster itself. Frankenstein's monster is, as it were, something of a natural element, and we are encountering in Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein as some sort of, again, a monster, but a conglomeration of nature and of humanity, you know, pieced together by parts of the human in the physical sense, but at the same time, it's an aberration, it's an abomination. This is a sort of anti-scientist sentiment that Mary Shelley is expressing here. Look how science attempts to wrestle with nature by simply throwing body parts together and creating these monstrous beings through its experimentation and its theory work. Look how science in this way, says Shelley, perhaps, my interpretation of her, how it dehumanizes human beings at once in the same move with denaturalizing nature. And again, in this attempt to try and overcome the impossibility of really understanding the depths of nature and humanity, it creates instead these catastrophes. Now, this anti-scientist sentiment is not completely founded on reason, but nonetheless, it's a really good telling of how the artists in many cases throughout Romanticism were rebelling against the science of their times. It's clear to some nowadays that science does need to kind of watch its footing in how it deals with things like cloning and genetic modification and so on and so forth. The more we come to know and invent, the more careful we will probably need to be in moving forward, which is the work, especially in my opinion, of sci-fi, to help us look ahead and see what sort of horrific things are possible. And that's what Mary Shelley's work in a way is. It's a sci-fi warning us of what sort of dangers science can also pose to us. Another great romantic piece there, late Romanticism really, though, in 1834. This is called The Deluge by John Martin. And what we see here is, well, the darkness and the depths. Now, what we're going to talk about is Schelling for a moment. Schelling was an extremely important influence, not just on Hegel, but on so many of the coming German idealists and the movement of the Romanticists. And Gaarder mentions them in passing only. But we need to take a moment to really understand how Schelling is actually, in a way, the fundamental impetus for what Hegel is going to bring to a head. So Schelling wants us to understand the way that darkness is reminiscent of the unconscious and of nature itself. So think, and we're not in Freud yet, where we're really going to maybe explicate what we mean by things like the unconscious. But just for now, sort of in a layman's way, let's think for a moment about everything that you're experiencing, and now think about all of the pre-existing conditions for what you're experiencing. What lies beneath the surface? What sort of decisions have already been made in your head that have yet to become clear? To what extent, I wave my hands a lot, I gesture a lot. To what extent am I even in control of this? When has my mind in some way already moved forward ahead of and underneath all the other phenomena that I think of as conscious, experiential qualities of my world? Schelling is trying to say, look, it's everything that seems to be apparent to us in the lights. I turned on the lights literally so this room would be bright enough we could see everything. The darkness is, in a way of speaking to what it is that we can't turn the lights on around. We can't, the processes that are responsible for the digestion of my breakfast this morning and the way that my body is continuing to age as I get older and so forth are all beyond my conscious experience. And they're all nonetheless preconditions for my conscious experience. And nature works this way too. If humanity is in any way related to nature at this time period, it obviously is to us today, but in this time period related to nature, then it's only humanity's continuing to bring more consciousness and more light, shine more light on things that were inherently dark. So when we look at a painting like the Deluge, we see more darkness than anything else, and yet we can also see if you can't tell what this is, there's on the bottom left here, there's a small boat and some men in there who are in the boat, and this entirety up here we get a glimpse of what I can only assume to be the moon, but it's almost like a dark evil spirit simultaneous. It's not meant to represent anything more than natural phenomenon, yet it's so clearly giving due credit to nature as far more, in a way, supernatural or more phenomenal than we've often done before. We see a wave, the crest of a wave, as these men are being tossed about in the storm somewhere in the ocean, and darkness envelops them, and almost like cracks of lightning break through. It's a horrific, what I like to think of as a God event. That is, can you imagine, presume for the moment that God is an existing being in some form. Could you imagine what the actual experience of such an existing being would be? Would it not be something like this, both at once beautiful and almost psychedelic in some ways, but also horrific and beyond anything rational, as it were? This is still sometimes the God portrayed by some religions and certain sects of those religions. And this is, in a way, part of what Schelling and others are wanting to speak to. For someone like Schelling, God is the movement of this consciousness moving through the unconsciousness of nature. That is, you have spirit and you have material or nature, and as it were, the darkness that is nature is in constant conflict and I won't say pure opposition, but is in interaction with spirit or God. And we find God moving through this. We experience consciousness. We see more and more light. Human beings are, after all, some sort of creation of God, right? Is the idea based on Judeo-Christian mythology. And then the idea is that eventually we would imagine that all will eventually be unified consciousness and light, which is this sort of universal consciousness that Gaarder is speaking to around the Romanticists. Let's introduce these two individuals now more fully. So, first we have Johann Fichte, who has a theory of knowledge that we're not going to go into details around, because ultimately we need to spend most of our time on Hegel. And then, of course, here down below is Schelling, as we've been talking about him already. Fichte's theory of knowledge ends up influencing people significantly as we move along. We're not going to get into the details of that theory, but it gives way to something we call doctrine of the will. And if we look at that, and then we at once also look at Schelling, and call what we just described of Schelling sort of a doctrine of the unconscious, then what we get together is a sort of knowledge that has to do with the unconscious and this movement towards greater knowledge is in a way also a movement towards greater consciousness. And we can call this, as Isaiah Berlin does, a doctrine of symbolism. And again, what's characteristic of this of this doctrine is the idea that while some things can be captured pretty coherently, if you study anything like information theory, which is a more modern conception, then you realize that a lot of the examples used there are things like traffic lights or lighthouses even. There's a lot of lights used in that. Things that are symbolic, things that are meant to provide signals for what to do or when to do or where you are and so forth. And these are all a sort of conventional type of symbolism. These are symbols that we could exchange any one of those for another thing. We could exchange a traffic light for a police officer doing the same thing of stopping and telling people when to go, or a lighthouse for maybe a smoke cloud or a fire. We could exchange those things, and we haven't, other than changed the medium, we haven't changed what it's in essence doing, what it's in essence representing, the stop and go function or the direction function. It's all going to be related by way of this conventional type of symbol. But then there's this other type of symbolism, which has to do with, again, what we were saying, the depth, the profundity of the unknowable. And so we're in this struggle with it because at once we attempt, as it were, to express the profundity of that unknowable, and to even in some cases come to try and know it better. But we ultimately can't and must reconcile that to be the case. We are resolved to trying to express it while also recognizing the impossibility of expressing it. And so now we come to Hegel. And with Hegel, we're going to get, again, a German idealist, someone who's going to take what we learned about Kant last time and, like many other German idealists of his time, do something different with it, say that Kant, you didn't go far enough, we're going to go farther than that than you even have committed yourself to. And he's also taking on this project that Schelling and Fichte and others have been talking about, have been discoursing on, and he's going to try and do philosophy differently in a way that Gaarder characterized, I think, fairly well, which is to express philosophy as something that does not found itself on some ground of truth-making, but recognizes that truths are dependent on the time period, on the unfolding from this movement of from unconscious to consciousness, from darkness to light, that is this unfolding, plurality to unity. For him, unity is ultimately going to be the culmination of all things, but if they weren't plural to begin with, then there would be nothing to unify. And of course, what he's primarily speaking in contradistinction to is Kant, right? So what is it about Kant? What is everybody getting on about when it comes to Kant? Let's go back to Kant for a second. Last we spoke of things, we mentioned Kant's Ding an sich, right? So in my Darumadal, I assume now, based on the reasoning that I've gleaned from Kant about the synthetic a priori, that and therefore how human cognition is capable of functioning in interaction with the things of the world, that there is my Daruma as a thing in itself, of which I can never really know. I can never really come to terms with. I can only think about and imagine likenesses of, but never really come to know. And there are, of course, appearances and whatnot, and there's phenomena. The very reason they're there in the first place, they can't, unlike, Hume's bundle of qualities, they need something to adhere to. So here we have the thing. And in a way, there's this bilateral conditioning to even interacting with the thing. At once, I am projecting a priori wise, I'm projecting reason, human cognition, faculty. I assume a time and space. I have to. I can't perceive the world otherwise. I can't exist in the world without a time and space, even if, according to Kant, that's not inherent to the world itself. It's inherent to my cognitive faculties to perceive things in terms of time and space. And so at once I am in a sense, projecting onto such things, but likewise, these things are forming the conscious experience that I'm having in that interaction, and are doing their dance within the time and space by which I perceive them. So there's this sort of going back and forth, although ultimately he still says it's about me. It's about the fact that I'm the one, that it ultimately has to do with what I'm projecting onto the world more than anything. And this is where I think the idealists, the German idealists, really start to run with it. Remember, we're going back again now to Locke and Berkeley. What was the distinction between Locke and Berkeley? Where did Berkeley get his greatest argument for almost a solipsistic type of idealism from? Well, it was looking at Locke's idea of the primary and the secondary qualities and saying, well, look, this model doesn't make sense, because if I can only understand and perceive or come to know of primary qualities by way of secondary qualities, then really it's all secondary qualities to begin with. There's no way to indicate, there's no primariness to which secondary qualities are to. Throw the model out. We need to just start back over with experience, pure empiricism itself, which turns out to be for him idealism. So there's no real thing out there beyond the mind for Berkeley. Keep this pattern in mind, because now let's fast forward again back to Kant. What is Kant saying? Kant is saying that regardless of primary versus secondary quality distinctions, he's saying there's a thing in itself, das Ding an sich, and then there's the experience, the phenomena, there's the only thing I really can come to directly understand about it. I have direct experience of the phenomena. I cannot have any direct connection with the noumena, the thing that is things in themselves. And this is almost a problem in itself, because noumena comes from the Greek word nous, which is something along the lines of mind. So what's going to be Hegel's move here? Among others, including Schelling and others, the German idealists are going to say the following, more or less, super simplified. In the same way that Berkeley said, look, you can't talk about primary qualities as if you don't experience them first by way of secondary qualities, which is really all there is then, and now the model's got to be thrown out. They're simply going to say, Kant, you didn't go far enough, bud. If you are saying that there's no way to even... I can't think about Dharma without thought. I can't perceive Dharma without phenomena. I can't perceive something in my hand without phenomena. And so the noumena, as it were, are all completely conditioned on, or they're based on the premise of there being phenomena. Well, what is that supposed to represent? In other words, if we're to assume das Ding an sich, or die Dinge an sich, that there are things in themselves out there beyond the mind and so forth, well, in what way can we have any account of that? When every time I can't have a tree without thinking tree. I can't look at any of these things here, or even imagine any of these things here without thought. This is really just phenomena, as it were. And for that reason, we kind of need to get beyond to this model of the phenomena versus the noumena. In a way, it's all phenomena. Here we've arrived at idealism again, hence why we call them the German idealists. This, too, as I've said before, has not gone away. We still see remnants of this in something we call correlationism, and hopefully we'll get more time to talk about that modern version of a sort of almost idealism again today. But we should start to see this pattern happening over and over again, where somebody starts to highlight a realism and then somebody counters it with an idealism. Perhaps this is Hegelian. Perhaps trying to conceptualize something real is always going to be met by its antithesis or opposite as idealist, and then we'll come up with some sort of grand unification or overcoming of that distinction. I just used a couple of words that he used frequently in his dialectics. Now, and Gaarder just calls it the dialectic process. Dialectics themselves, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy definition of a method of philosophical argument that involves some sort of contradictory process between opposing sides. I say A, and then some proposition B gives the conclusion of not A. And so, but both of these appear to be true in some form in reality, so we have to converge and overcome that distinction by way of C, that is not an A and not A, unless you ask some people, perhaps Hegel would say otherwise. A and not A is perhaps precisely what C is saying. But it gives us a way of moving forward, and then eventually we'll come across a proposition D that assumes or concludes not C, and we keep moving forward. We can see this really clearly in his language around it, except now these are moving downward and I was moving upward. This graphic is kind of odd to me in a way, but that's all right. So here we have thesis and antithesis. A tension is created between these, and if that tension is not eventually resolved, it often just fades away and we don't hear much of it again. But often what happens, at least the ones that matter, says someone like Hegel perhaps, is that the tension is created and then it is eventually resolved, and that resolution is the synthesis. One example of this that Gaarder mentions, but he does not flesh out, and I think he, for obvious reasons, as an introductory to philosophy class, maybe is a little bit hesitant to go into detail about, is how Hegel arrives at the idea of becoming. Do you remember, a long time ago, we talked about this as one of those great philosophical problems, explored probably not first and foremost by Plato, but definitely coming to a head in Plato's work, in his dialogues. Being and becoming. That is, being as being X, being something in the world, but then becoming as something of this transition from X to Y. So if you are a puppy, you are being puppy, but the idea is eventually you're going to be a dog. And Aristotle didn't like the way that Plato necessarily characterized this process. He recognized he needed a new process. You can go back and rewatch that if you need a review of that. What does Hegel say about this? You maybe noticed Gaarder says something about how it's the distinction between being and nothing. But we can do better than this, I think. We can say exactly how such an antithesis comes about in the first place. It's not as simple as, well, I'm alive now and I'll die later, and there's being and then nothingness. It's very poetic, but it's not quite what he's getting at. Take again being. So something exists, as it were, and we then can start to imagine, thought experiment, try taking away all the things that the properties, the qualities, the phenomena aspect, take away all the qualities of the thing that you see existing before you. Go on and try it. Try and take away all qualities and properties, not just the whiteness, the different colors, the shininess, but even, I'm literally holding this thing. I can feel smoothness. I have a weight to it. If I take away all the properties and qualities of it, what will I have? Well, at least by way of thought experiment, we'd have what Hegel calls pure being. It's just existence as it is alone without the qualities. This is a hard thing to wrap our minds around, but it's important to do so because what is that essentially? Well, we can't imagine that's nothing. That's exactly his point. Pure being is nothing. So here we have a thesis, being. And if you get at the essence of being, you realize that pure being is nothingness. It is nothing. And likewise, nothing is pure being. So what is the synthesis then? What is it that reconciles the tension between these two things? Is the essence of things nothing, or is it being? What is it? We have to come at a description of the world as a massive becoming. Becoming becomes our synthesis. Notice this word synthesis is very different from the way Kant was talking about it. you may be going back and saying, is this related somehow to the synthetic a priori? No, it's not that idea of synthesis. This is synthesis in the way, not connecting of ideas in order to come up with a plausible description for something. This synthesis rather is the, as it were, resolving of tensions of prior ideas by not just combining them, but finding a new formation of the problem, moves us forward in reconciling the problem. And so, going back for a moment to that process that was inspired by Schelling and even Fichte, what is Hegel doing that's so new here? To philosophy, he's trying to say we have to contextualize truths, as it were, and something that's true at one time period is not true at another time period. The being versus becoming debate is, in essence, a way that we can see becoming being the synthesis of being versus nothing, perhaps even dating all the way back to Parmenides. And we can see lots of this happening, not just in philosophical ideas, although he says this is the highest form of this activity, and ultimately it's the biggest culmination point, as Gaarder mentions as well. But it is also just happening in the very events that are taking place at this time. Napoleon entering and to take in and conquer Prussia, and the recent French Revolution that has taken place. What is eventually also going to take place in light of Marx and so forth, which we will be talking about next time, as an important student of Hegel's. We're going to see that historical events by someone like Hegel are seen as this battle and this creation and formation of tensions that must be reconciled over time. And here again, in a sense, what God is for him. Do you remember what this term, absolute spirit, by, again, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the highest, most developed and most adequate understanding of spirit as attained by philosophy. The absolute spirit is Hegel's way of describing God, and it is a formation, it is a movement, as it were, of the conscious and through the unconsciousness. If spirit or mind is the sort of thesis, then its antithesis is nature. If it's the light and the dark, again, in some forms or versions, but mind or spirit then is in this dramatic tension with nature or material, and we can only come to a synthesis of that through, in that plurality, unifying over time through all the historical events that take place, where new truths are formed and then countered, and then new truths are given birth through that, and so forth. We eventually come to absoluteness, that is God in his prime, as it were. And again, this is a Judeo-Christian God. This is the God, as it were, that is meant to be described in these religions. Now, one thing that's really characteristic about German, we're going to talk about German language for a quick second. If you haven't seen German before, you'll recognize it often by, of course, certain spellings and such, but also importantly by the way that it treats all nouns as requiring capital letters. So when you see in books like Gaarder's and elsewhere these things like absolute spirit, or thesis and antithesis, of course, in German being rendered differently, as having capital letters, that's a German language stylistic move there. It's something that evolved over time and now continues to this day to be the case, where nouns are given capital letters. So, and of course, things given capital letters, as more or less it does for English, you'd think it might distill it a little bit, and maybe it has, but it still appears to be given more weight than something that does not have capital letters. Big T versus small t truth is what we say all the time. Big T truth being, of course, the grander, weightier truth versus the small truth, maybe of the individual with a small t. So maybe even, in a way, using Hegelian reasoning around this, maybe even the German language itself as the context for this philosophy sets it up to make it look as it does, that there would be something like some grandiose, absolute spirit or God moving through history, culminating over time into absolute spirit at the end by way of the purest forms of knowledge and understanding, i.e. philosophy. Maybe that's all set up in the first place by simply having capital letters riddled throughout your language. Now, next time that we go down this path, we'll be leaving aesthetics again for a little while, because Marx is going to get us down the path of politics and understanding the relationship that Marx had to Hegel, not a direct student relationship, but as a student of Hegel nonetheless. We'll see how this has had a profound effect on many people's views of the world today, and why even Marxism, including bouts of cultural Marxism, continue to be brought up time and again in this age. So we'll speak more to that next time.